Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The New Polytheism by David L. Miller and James Hillman. And this is really by David Miller, but there's an appendix that is of significant size, I think, and importance, that is an edition by James Hillman. James Hillman is a Jungian psychoanalyst, and I believe that was added in. The original version of this didn't include that appendix, but it was added in, and there's a preface that was added in, and there's an introduction that was added in for this edition. This is the 1981 edition of this book. Originally, it was published in 1974, but I have the later version. And it's a short book. It's less than 150 pages. I can only imagine it was even shorter when it first came out, before it had these editions. But even with the additions, it's a pretty short book. But it's a good one. I read this a few years ago, and I've just been really waiting for the right opportunity to do this. And I guess now is that time, so I'm going to go ahead and cover this book today. It's really good. It explores a couple of different concepts about polytheism, what polytheism is, from a very direct belief in the anthropomorphic gods as supernatural entities, to other more metaphorical concepts of the gods, Jungian psychoanalytical concepts of the gods as representing archetypes, or as representing different aspects of human society, or representing different ways of seeing the world, different values. There are many ways to understand the gods and polytheism, and this explores a few of those, which I really appreciate. It's not just a die-hard supernatural approach, which I'm interested in reading about, but I don't actually really subscribe to a hardcore supernatural concept of the gods as these beings that exist out in the universe somewhere, somehow. I don't buy it, but I do think that polytheism is an interesting area of study, and it's an interesting way of viewing the world when you take it in a more naturalistic way, when you understand it naturalistically and not supernaturally. So he brings up a number of authors also, from Nietzsche to Heidegger to Norman Brown and a bunch of other people. So he talks about a lot of other authors and how they have spoken about polytheism, either directly or indirectly. He also talks about the ancient Greeks quite a bit. So there's a lot of good stuff in here. Like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections. I actually have quite a few sections here that I want to read. I just want to read the stuff from David Miller in this episode, but I do want to come back to this and do a second episode where I talk about James Hillman's appendix. So I think next episode will be James Hillman, and this episode is the David Miller portion of this book. He introduces the book, and once you're past the introduction is really like him coming back and talking about revisions he's made and what he would do differently in writing the book, pointing out a few things where he thinks he got it wrong. We'll skip over that, and we'll jump into the actual original chapter 1. And he introduces this with an extended quote from Nietzsche about polytheism. But I'll skip over that. I'm gonna move forward just a bit and jump in here where he says, quote, "A new batch of science fiction, ritual happenings in drama where the theater of the absurd used to reign, a flowery counterculture, new sensuality concerning nature, and new sexuality concerning the body, veritable expansions of consciousness everywhere. Perhaps nothing is more remarkable about the way we have been going on than the diversity of our new themes and their accompanying lifestyles. When one searches for a least common denominator in our present sensibilities, a new root metaphor, some emerging center of concern, what one discovers is that the factors of our meaning simply dance all over the map of our being. In order to name our present condition, interpreters have had to rely on a strange set of words. In tracing our psychology, Charles Baudouin speaks of polymorphic meaning and being. In speaking of the nature of thinking required for contemporary understanding, Philip Wheelwright points to plurisignificative knowing and communicating. Norman O. Brown talks about polymorphous reality as a key to our history, and Ray Hart names the deepest aspect of our literate articulations of reality with the phrase polysemous functioning of imaginal discourse. If we try to make sense of our society, Michael Novak suggests it will help to think of America as a pluralistic community of radically unmeltable ethnics. Concerning government and political science, Robert Dahl speaks of polyarchy. Nietzsche's name for all this is polytheism. He says it straight out, rather than hiding the radicalness of where we are behind a barrage of academic verbiage. By polytheism, Nietzsche means that lurking in all the poly and plural abstractions of our scholarship is something very concrete and real. We have suffered a death of God. But we discover a new opportunity after the passing of the first shadow of despair that comes from the loss of a single center holding all things together. The death of God was, in fact, the demise of a monotheistic way of thinking and speaking about God, and a monotheistic way of thinking and speaking about human meaning and being generally. The announcement of the death of God was the obituary of a useless, single-minded, and one-dimensional norm of a civilization that has been predominantly monotheistic, not only in its religion, but also in its politics, its history, its social order, its ethics, and its psychology. When released from the tyrannical imperialism of monotheism by the death of God, man has the opportunity of discovering new dimensions hidden in the depths of reality's history. He may discover a new freedom to acknowledge variousness and many-sidedness. He may find, as if for the first time, a new potency to create imaginatively his hopes and desires, his laws and pleasures. The point Nietzsche is making is that our personal and social bondage has been a slavery to a specific kind of theological thinking and speaking, and therefore our new sensibility is also a theological breakthrough at base. Nietzsche can be concrete where other analysts of culture are abstract. He can be materially realistic where others are formally intellectualistic. The death of God gives rise to the rebirth of the gods. We are polytheists. End quote. So here we get the death of God, and he opens up talking about all the variety of different new things that are happening, new ways. Now, this is written in 1974, and there's definitely a bit of infatuation with the late 60s, early 70s counterculture and the newness of all of the new things that were happening in society, breaking away from the sort of stiff old squares, which I'll admit there's definitely some interesting stuff that happened at that time period. There's also some very damaging things that happened at that time period. But, hindsight's 20/20. And again, we are of the vulture mindset, so that 1969 is a corpse lying in the field of history, and we are vultures picking over its corpse. And I guarantee you there are no ideological corpses laying around that don't have at least one juicy bit inside that we can pluck out and bring back to the nest for the enrichment of our people. And the same is true with the late 60s, early 70s. There's something there that we can find of value, and I think we can look here to see some of that. But there's also some things that he describes in here that now, looking back on this decades later, we think, oh my gosh, that doesn't sound right. He says Michael Novak suggests it will help to think of America as a pluralistic community of radically unmeltable ethnics. That's not really super helpful for us as a people to be like that, I don't think. And if you think to early polytheists like the ancient Greeks, they were definitely not like that. They were very conscious of the difference between the Greeks and the barbarians. And the same applies to ethnic groups in Northern Europe and all over the world. It would certainly behoove us to remember that just because we could find things in polytheism that we appreciate doesn't necessarily mean that things are good by virtue of their being fractured. So having a fractured nation that is comprised of quote-unquote pluralistic enclaves of unmeltable ethnics is not really that's not really a by default good objective. And I would argue that it is by default a bad thing to have for a singular society to be fractured in that way. But anyhow, he says that a bunch of people have talked about this modern reality of being having a polymorphic society, having a society that is comprised of a multitude of different groups, a multitude of different values, a multitude of different things. What we could really call it is polytheistic, as Nietzsche refers to it as. Nietzsche looks at a lot of society in somewhat religious terms and thinks that what we're really dealing with in the modern world is polytheism. Let me just jump back to the part, I didn't read this part, but this is from Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, monotheism, the rigid consequence of the doctrine of one normal human being, consequently the belief in a normal God, beside whom there are only false, spurious gods, has perhaps been the greatest danger of mankind in the past. In polytheism, man's free-thinking and many-sided thinking has a prototype set up. The power to create for himself new and individual eyes, always newer and more individualized. So, Nietzsche supports the end of monotheism and the end of a rigid, singular way of being. And the author here, Miller, says that the death of God, speaking about the death of God, as Nietzsche did, was really talking about the death of a monotheistic way of thinking and speaking, about human meaning and being. Anyway, let me move forward to the next section. Just immediately following what I just read, he says, quote, polytheism is the name given to a specific religious situation. The situation is characterized by plurality, a plurality that manifests itself in many forms. Socially, polytheism is a situation in which there are various values, patterns of social organization, and principles by which man governs his political life. These values, patterns, and principles sometimes mesh harmoniously, but more often they war with one another to be elevated as the single center of normal social order. Such a situation would be sheer anarchy and chaos, were it not possible to identify the many orders as each containing a coherence of its own. Socially understood, polytheism is eternally in unresolvable conflict with social monotheism, which, in its worst form, is fascism, and in its less destructive forms is imperialism, capitalism, feudalism, and monarchy. There is an incipient polytheism always lurking in democracy. This polytheism will surface during the history of democracies if the civilization does not first succumb to anarchy. In calling our time polytheist, we are saying something about the state of democracy in our time. Polytheism is not only a social reality, it is also a philosophical condition. It is that reality experienced by men and women when truth, with a capital T, cannot be articulated reflectively according to a single grammar, a single logic, or a single symbol system. It is a situation that exists when metaphors, stories, anecdotes, aphorisms, puns, dramas, and movies, with all their mysterious ambiguity, seem more compelling than the rhetoric of political, religious, and philosophical systems. They seem more compelling than tightly argued and logically coherent explanations of self and society because they allow for multiple meanings to exist simultaneously, as if truth, goodness, and beauty can never be contained in a logic that allows for only one of the following: good versus evil, light versus dark, truth versus fiction, reality versus illusion, being versus becoming. In a philosophically polytheistic situation, the new science of the time will break forth with principles of relativism, indeterminacy, plural logic systems, irrational numbers, substances that do not have substance, such as quarks, double explanations for light, and black holes in the middle of actual realities. Psychologically, polytheism is a matter of the radical experience of equally real but mutually exclusive aspects of the self. Personal identity cannot seem to be fixed. Normalcy cannot be defined. The person experiences himself as many selves, each of which is felt to have autonomous power, a life of its own, coming and going on its own and without regard to the centered will of a single ego. Yet, surprisingly, This experience is not sensed as a pathology. One gets along quite well in reality. In fact, the very disparateness of the multifaceted self seems to have survival power. It seems to carry with it a certain advantage in the face of the times. If the academic psychology, by which the self explains the self to itself, is monotheistic, and cannot provide sufficient rationale for its understanding in such a time, then the psychology will itself have to be reformed polytheistically. The word polytheism is used for these social, philosophical, and psychological manifestations of plurality in everyday life because behind them is a religious situation. Religiously, polytheism is the worship of many gods and goddesses. Though monotheism, with its exclusive forms, say in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, rules out the possibility of polytheism in religion, polytheism, in a curious way, includes a monotheism of sorts. The great polytheist cultures, Greek, Hindu, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, American Indian, have, in actual practice, been composed of communities of men and women who worship one god or goddess, or at least they worship one at a time, Athena, Vishnu, Ra, Baal, Wakan Tanka. The theologies of these people, however, affirm the reality and the worship of many. This implies that a polytheistic religion is actually a polytheistic theology, a system of symbolizing reality in a plural way in order to account for all experience, but that the religious practice is composed of consecutive monotheisms. Similarly, it would seem possible that one might profess a monotheistic faith but need a polytheistic theology to account for all of one's experiences in the life context of that faith. Thus, we need to distinguish between polytheism and monotheism in religion on the one hand and in theology on the other. The former has to do with a practice, a behavior, and the latter has to do with the explanation system needed to account for one's experiences in that practice and behavior. The social, philosophical, and psychological polytheism of our time is an experience that is sufficiently radical to call for a polytheistic theology. This implies that our experience of social, intellectual, and psychological worlds is religious. That is, it is so profound and far-reaching that only a theological explanation can account for it fully. But what does this mean about the theological explanations about the nature of the gods and goddesses? It means that the gods and goddesses are the names of powers, or forces, which have autonomy and are not conditioned by or affected by social and historical events, by human will or reason, or by personal and individual factors. This is one meaning of our use of the word immortal, as it is applied to divinities. The gods are not contingent upon the conditions of mortality. Insofar as they manifest themselves in life, they are felt to be informing powers that give shape to social, intellectual, and personal behavior. The gods and goddesses are the names of the plural patterns of our existence. Their stories are the paradigms and symbols that allow us to account for, to express, and to celebrate those multiple aspects of our reality that otherwise would seem fragmented and anarchic. In Western culture, the polytheistic theology that would enable us to name our plurality so as to obtain an Archimedean point of leverage on life died with the collapse of the Greek culture. From then on, our explanation systems, whether theological, sociological, political, historical, philosophical, or psychological, have, in the main, been monotheistic. That is, they have been operating according to fixed concepts and categories, which were controlled by a logic that demanded a rigorous and decisive either-or. Either true or false, either this or that, either beautiful or ugly, either good or evil. It is this monotheistic thinking that fails a people in a time when experience becomes self-consciously pluralistic, radically both and. Monotheistic thinking is especially ill-equipped to handle pluralistic understanding when the multiple meanings flowing through social and psychological reality seem to have autonomous power, like the gods and goddesses, and when the multifaceted layers of reality, like the divinities, seem not to be in control of the society or the individual at the very time when that society and that individual feel freed into the openness of new possibility, shocked into a radically liberating future. End quote. So the author is attempting to give a sort of rough sketch of what polytheism is, and he talks about it in a couple of different manners. to jump into the beginning, he says that it is a specific religious situation characterized by plurality, and that plurality manifests itself in different forms. And those forms that are described are socially, philosophically, and psychologically. So he says socially, polytheism is a situation in which there are various values, patterns of social organization, and principles by which man governs his political life. Now, it's important to keep track of what we're saying. A single people can have multiple values. A singular people don't have to have one singular value. So you might have something like truth. You might have freedom. You might have beauty. And I've talked about this in the past, about these things, particularly about truth and freedom. Politically, when we think of freedom, you've got your libertarian faction that elevates freedom as the singular goal. So this is a sort of monotheistic way of thinking about values, that there's one thing that we're after. The highest value is freedom, human freedom, the freedom of the American citizen. All other aspects of politics, all other aspects of society need to be oriented around maximizing human freedom. Some people just believe in freedom to that extent. This is largely the view of the libertarian. The idea that we would limit our freedom, in some way other than, say, the non-aggression principle, which is your general idea that your freedom is limited when it impedes my freedom. You don't have the freedom to restrict my freedom. That's the kind of the core nugget of it, and it makes sense. But that view, when you really radically stick to it, is the elevation of freedom above all other things. Some people elevate the truth above all other things. These are the philosophers, largely, and also scientists, but really philosophers do this, I think, an awful lot. What we're really after is the truth. And if it can be destroyed by the truth, then it should be destroyed by the truth. Everything must bow before the pursuit of the truth. This is, again, monotheistic way of thinking. So it's not the case that you necessarily need to have a society where you've got fragments of the society. One part of the society elevates truth. One part of the society elevates freedom. Have you really got a polytheistic society, or have you got a multitude of competing monotheisms? It's possible for us to, in each of us, individually, as well as within a cohesive society, a unified society, to recognize the importance of truth and freedom and beauty and virtue and strength and loyalty and etc. These a multitude of values that all get their time in the sun in the appropriate moments and in the appropriate circumstances. This or that value comes to the fore, contingently and based on the circumstances. That's more of the concept of a polytheistic society. He says the values, patterns, and principles sometimes mesh harmoniously, but more often they're at war with one another, seeking to be elevated as the single center of normal social order. So each of these competing factions wants its own way to compete to become the top value. And that's I think, a relic of monotheism within the polytheistic framework. So he says such a situation would be sheer anarchy and chaos, were it not possible to identify the many orders as each containing a coherence of its own. I don't think that that's necessarily true. So you may have a bunch of competing factions in a society that is each coherent on its own, but you still have anarchy on the whole as these factions compete with one another. I mean, competition is fine and good, and factions should compete with one another. But when the competition reigns supreme over the unification of the society, then you have anarchy and chaos, right? When it's sort of Aristotelian in a way when he talks about the mean of the different virtues. So Aristotle will say, you don't take this particular virtue all the way. You have an excess or a defect. You don't want to have an excess of courage because it becomes foolhardiness. You don't want to have a defect or a shortage of courage. You become timid and cowardly. You need just the correct amount, not too much, not too little, like Goldilocks. And the same goes for all the other virtues, all the cardinal Greek virtues and everything else. You find a middle point between them, and then at that point you can accommodate multiples. Like if you're a good person according to, Greek virtue ethics, then you have all of these things. You have temperance, and you have courage, and you have wisdom, and you have justice. Not too much of any, but just the right mix of all of them. So in a society where each faction is coherent on its own, that doesn't mean that that any of the factions are balanced. And of course, you've got a little bit of the libtard here, that comes through in 1974, of course, where the polytheism is eternally an unresolvable conflict with social monotheism, which in its worst form is fascism. Its less destructive forms are imperialism, capitalism, feudalism, monarchy. Monarchy, especially, there have been a lot of pagan societies that were monarchies. And that's not necessarily a monotheistic thing for one person to be in charge. He says polytheism is more, he says there's an incipient polytheism always lurking in democracy. And there's truth to this, right? Democracy allows for these different factions to exist, compete with one another without bloodshed. A society that has a multitude of values can be democratic, but monarchy is one value among many. You might say monarchy has its benefits and democracy has its benefits. There are downsides to democracy. I've spoken about them in previous episodes. Democracy itself is not bad. It's just limited. It can't do everything. Democracy can't do everything. A society wholly devoted to democracy will wind up with flaws because it can't flush out the flaws of democracy because it refuses to recognize them. If it recognized the flaws in democracy, then it would say, okay, democracy has to be constrained in the following ways. And maybe there's aspects of aristocracy that have value, aspects of monarchy that have value. So I don't think that the polytheistic concept really just lives in democracy alone, and monarchy or aristocracy are, carry a permanent stain of monotheistic thinking or something like that. That's a bit of a 1974 libtard way of looking at things. But he does say that polytheism will surface during the history of democracies if the civilization does not first succumb to anarchy. So I think we can say clearly that there's a potential in democracy to become balkanized, fractured, for the different factions to go to war with one another, or for the society to descend into anarchy because there's no unification. There's no singular way that the society is expected to be. There's nothing that defines you as in or out of the society. Lots of sort of problems can arise from being too dedicated to one particular way. At any rate, he says it's not only a social reality, it's a philosophical condition. Truth with a capital T cannot be articulated reflectively according to a single grammar, a single logic, or a single symbol system. And think about values. We have all sorts of different sorts of values. Like, what is truth beyond perhaps like the singular scientific definition of truth, something that's been verified through experimentation and peer-reviewed journals and everything. Sometimes there's truth in a story. Sometimes there's truth comes from the average person who doesn't have a doctorate. Sometimes truth is just like that. And that's a sort of polytheistic way of approaching the truth. It comes in different forms. And this polytheism allows for multiple meanings to exist simultaneously. Whereas if you've got a philosophy that is, good versus evil, light versus dark, there's the right way and the wrong way, and that's it. Monotheism is really twofold. It's not just about a singular thing, because there's also the opposite of that thing. If you value freedom above all else, then you invariably will have a word for tyranny or not freedom, the right way, and then there's the wrong way. So it's almost by default a dichotomous viewpoint of, the correct and the incorrect, truth, fiction, reality, illusion. And that sort of dichotomy is monotheistic. And there's some amount of value in that, but Certainly, a society that's dominated by that kind of thinking is a monotheistic society, and a society that says, well, there are multiple ways of looking at something, and each of these ways of looking at it has some value in it. That's more of a polytheistic philosophy. And then the third way that we experience polytheism is psychologically, where now we're talking about different aspects of the self. The person experiences himself as many selves, each of which is felt to have autonomous power. So we've got different aspects of ourselves. You've heard of code switching. We all do it. You've got a way that you behave while you're at work. You've got a way that you behave while you're hanging out drinking with your friends. And it's not necessarily the same. You've got different aspects to yourself, different selves, different ways of being, different parts of your psychology. And of course, behind this, there's the religious concept. But what's interesting is he does say that the gods and goddesses are the names of powers or forces which have autonomy and are not conditioned by or affected by social and historical events, by human will or reason. I think that might be overstating the case a little. I do think that different cultures have different sets of gods and different values, and those aren't necessarily eternal. We change, the mythologies change, the stories change over time, the gods change, gods are adopted or abandoned. Things change over time. None of it's particularly immortal. And when society encounters a certain situation, it may find that its present array of deities is not sufficient to guide the people through the challenge. It has to be flexible to say, let's switch things up a little. Let's alter the mythology. This has happened many times in among many different peoples. The mythology changes as circumstances change. I think we should remember that there's two aspects of this. There's one aspect, well, there's several, maybe more than two. There's an aspect by which gods and goddesses represent the fundamental structure of reality. In and out, up and down, night and day, towards and away from, kind of concepts that just exist. Space and time, right? Space and time are the fundamental aspects of reality. You might have a god of time and a goddess of space or a goddess of matter or what have you. The fundamental aspects of reality are represented by gods. Also, the aspects of the unconscious, the structures, the archetypal structures of the human mind, can love and hatred, friendship. These things can have gods and goddesses that represent them. But there's also a social contingent, circumstantial element. You might have a king of gods during such a time when monarchy is important. That the concept of kinghood might fade away in a time when society is more democratic, and we don't want to talk about a king of the gods because it doesn't mesh with our society. And so I think the gods and goddesses change according to human circumstances, maybe a little bit more than the author is willing to admit. But at any rate, let's keep moving. He talks about an author by name of H. Richard Niebuhr, who wrote a book called Radical Monotheism in Western Culture. Niebuhr is a critic of polytheism. He sees polytheism rising in the West, and he opposes it. But the author does think that Miller here does think that Niebuhr raises some good and interesting points, despite the fact that he is not in favor of polytheism. He still talks about it in a way that can be useful. So he says, quote, Niebuhr defines gods as value centers, the principle of being and value, and the center of worth. And then he notes that we have many such principles and centers. In fact, he argues that our natural religion is polytheistic. Certainly Niebuhr is realistic enough to note that this view will come as a surprise to many who live in Western culture dominated by the monotheisms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But though our religious and political institutions are officially monotheist, one nation under God, our social existence contains many values, many principles of being, many centers of worth. We give these gods semi-personal names such as truth, beauty, justice, peace, love, goodness, pleasure, patriotism, and so on. Our consciousness has even derived a polytheistic theology or mythology of our gods, a system of thinking and speaking about these centers of meaning, which claims that they have autonomous power over man's actions. Niebuhr notes, too, that the pluralism of gods has a counterpart in a pluralism of society and self. What is valuable for us is not the wholeness of our society or ourselves, but the many activities which Niebuhr calls a bundle of functions. This sort of polytheism is no peculiarly modern problem, Niebuhr thinks, but a part of every period of human history. It is the sort of thing Walter Lippmann described in his Preface to Morals, when he said that for man, each ideal is supreme within a sphere of its own. There is no point of reference outside which man can determine the relative value of competing ideals. Lippmann felt that man's impulses are no longer part of one attitude toward life. They are free and they are incommensurable. Niebuhr finds this human condition to be man's eternal situation, a situation he calls social faith. None of us, Niebuhr argues, can live without a cause, without some center of worth, be that conscious or unconscious. This is a curious and inescapable fact about our lives, which means that all men have some faith simply because they are men. Even atheism, presumably, is a faith that speaks to specific men out of some center of concern. But Niebuhr affirms not only that man is a sort of faith animal at base, but also man's natural polytheism, saying that, beyond the dark powers, the Chthonian deities of the physical life of man, there are our Olympian gods, our country, our ideologies, our democracies, civilization, churches, our art, which we practice for art's sake, our truth, which we pursue for truth's sake, our moral values, our ideals, and the social forces, which we personalize, adore, and on which we depend for deliverance from sheer nothingness and the utter inconsequence of existence. Realizing this pluralism of centers in life, we dream of integration, of a great pantheon, in which all the gods will be duly served. But this integration of civilization and of personality in the form of a hierarchy of values, a fixed circle, forever eludes our grasp. Synthesis of meaning and being is not achieved because each god, in turn, requires a certain absolute devotion and the denial of the claims of the other gods. Niebuhr feels that this failure leads to a great tragedy. The tragedy of polytheism is that it divides us within ourselves and from our fellow man. But to him, an even greater tragedy is the twilight of the gods. Since none of the many centers of worth that supply life with meaning and significance is able to be an eternal source, each god, in its turn, seems to die. When social causes and the empires of value crumble, nothing is left to defend us against the void of meaninglessness. Two things should be immediately clear from Niebuhr's account of polytheism. First, it is the opposite of Nietzsche's. For Nietzsche, monotheism leads to the death of God and the specter of meaninglessness. But for Niebuhr, it is polytheism that leads us to this apocalyptic end. Second, Niebuhr's thinking and speaking about religion, his theologizing, takes its shape from a sociological vision. All that he says about the gods is interpreted as having something to do with man's behavior in the social order. The gods are social values. They are principles for being in a world whose central characteristic is seen to be groups of men standing in varying relationships to other men. Even when Niebuhr speaks of the self, it is in terms of man's social roles, a psychological self-definition that is finally sociological. As he sees it, polytheism is a social faith. End quote. Okay, so there's a little bit about this guy Niebuhr and what he has to say, and there's a lot of interesting stuff there. He talks about how we have these... he says, our social existence contains many values, many principles of being, many centers of worth. He says Niebuhr defines gods as value centers, the principles of being and value in the center of worth. So that's a pretty interesting way, like that thing which you value most, that thing which is the center of your value system. We give them names: truth, beauty, justice, peace, love, goodness, pleasure, patriotism. And we treat them as if they're almost anthropomorphic. We say these things have autonomous power over man's actions. He says Niebuhr argues that none of us can live without a cause. Even atheism is a faith that speaks to specific men out of some center of concern. So the atheist still has something that he values. It may be truth. It may be that the atheist says, well, the truth is that we live in a world without supernatural deities. And in my affirmation of this truth, I will proclaim myself to be an atheist. And that's kind of where I come down. I think this is what's true. And it's important to me that I speak the truth. It's important to me that I believe things that are true and not things that are false. And so for that reason, I make this claim. But that puts truth as an important value. It's not that the atheist doesn't have any values. It's that the atheist doesn't believe in supernatural sources of value, but in some other natural source of value. But he still has something that could be described as a center of value or a center of worth and a social value. And in this case, if that's what gods are, then that's what the atheist believes in. What's interesting is he says that when we realize the pluralism of centers in life, we dream of integration, we dream of a great pantheon in which all the gods will be duly served, but this never happens because each god in turn requires a certain absolute devotion and the denial of the claims of the other gods. And that seems to be the case because it does seem as though, at least among people, it's hard to say what the gods demand, but among people who believe in truth, they'll elevate that truth to be the highest priority. So truth demands total subservience. If you want to really seek the truth, then you have to put all other things aside. If you want to really seek freedom, absolute freedom, you have to put all the other things aside. None of the gods can be worshipped in their totality while still leaving room for the others. So each one has to receive its due, but none of them can be king and lord over all the other gods. Each of them needs to kind of have a sphere in which it rules and other spheres in which it does not rule. And so Niebuhr believes this is a sort of great tragedy, that they can't be really integrated. I feel like most polytheistic societies do manage to find a way to integrate. They have pantheons. The ancient Greeks had a pantheon. The Hindus have a pantheon. Each god has its domain. None of the gods is allowed total control. Even Zeus doesn't have total control. He has to contend with the other gods. Even though he's king of gods, he's not a tyrant. He can't be a tyrant. He has to contend with his wife, Hera. He has to contend with the things the other gods do. So Nietzsche, he compares this to Nietzsche. He says Nietzsche believes that the death of God comes from monotheism, and Niebuhr thinks that polytheism leads to the death of the gods because none of these centers of life these centers of worth can be completely provide a complete answer, and the pantheon cannot be achieved. Which I think the pantheon can be achieved, but if you assume that the pantheon and the integration of the gods into a coherent harmony can never be achieved, then we're always dangling on the precipice of meaninglessness. And the other thing he says is that Niebuhr's vision is sociological. The gods are social values. They're principles for being in a world whose central characteristic is seen to be groups of men standing in varying relationships to other men. And I think that in that sense, Niebuhr is probably correct. But anyway, let's move to the next section where he talks a little bit more about monotheism and the dangers that it presents. And this is, again, he's got a bit of a liberal bias in some of the things he says here. He says, quote, "Certainly Homer, who spoke of the gods in connection with that agonizing piece of culture history we call the Trojan War, Hesiod, who in the Theogony tells all the stories of the gods in a mythic fashion, Aeschylus, who wrote the dramas of the gods in relation to Greek political life, and Orpheus, who sang the songs of the gods in his cult. Certainly, all these were theologians. Their thought was systematic, but it was not theoretical. It was epic, narrative, drama, and song, each of which was utterly concrete in its imagery. Theology was not yet composed of doctrines, theories, and formal structures of logical argument. Myth had not yet intellectualized itself into dogma. Precisely the rationalizing, abstracting process in the science of divine things is what would happen after Plato, after thinkers had learned their philosophical lessons. There is a sort of fascism about rationalism and intellectualism, a sort of rigid, one-party dictatorship of the mind, which forcibly suppresses feelings and intuitions expressed in concrete images and symbolized in the telling of stories. It would seem inevitable that the god of a monotheistic theology would die, that he would suffer an ineluctable demise, The imperialism of the mind, like that of Prometheus's Zeus, cannot forever endure without the resource of life that comes from feeling and intuition. The mind simply cannot account for all of life. By itself, it is finally impotent. Thinking monotheistically about the deepest matters of the heart and spirit cannot put man in touch with life, as can another sort of theologia, the telling of the tales of the gods and goddesses in personified concreteness. Yet not only is social and psychological fascism a danger lurking in monotheistic thinking, but there is a danger in polytheism, too, especially if one thinks it, like Niebuhr, in a sociological way. On the one hand, we can continue in the direction of what, theologically regarded, is a proliferating polytheism. On the other hand, we are asked to submit, for the sake of order and peace, to some overlordship, whether this be exercised in the name of a nation or cause whose security is valued beyond all other goods, or of a movement that promises to deliver man from evil by 5-year stages. Polytheism is as real in reputedly irreligious modern society as it ever was, though now the gods go by the name of values or of powers. The greater the fragmentation, the greater is the peril and the attractiveness of some monistic organization of study or devotion. The argument and the warning should be clear as a bell in our time. A pluralistic society with subcultures, countercultures, generation gaps, and relativized moral codes is ripe for the next overarching ideology that comes along. Any fascism will serve to organize our anarchic social polytheism into a pantheon as long as it is rigid enough, being thereby apparently strong, secure, and stable. Certainly this is a real danger. But the danger of monotheism is equally clear from the story of how we got to be monotheists in the West, even before the time of the prophets of Judaism or the proclamations of Jesus or Mohammed. Monotheism came about in the evolution of a self-consciousness that thought and spoke about itself in a certain way. It is not that all thinking is monotheistic. It is rather that all abstract, formal, logical, and speculative thinking is inevitably monotheistic. As soon as one asks for the essence, or substance, or principle of being behind the diversity and richness of what appears on the face of all life, the question itself leads to a kind of thinking and speaking that eventually will lose touch with reality. And if the gods and goddesses are spoken of and thought of in this monotheistic, one-dimensional, univocal way, religion will not be able to comprehend itself in relation to everyday life, while life, in turn, will not be able to discover its deep religious dimensions. End quote. So here we have some thoughts about the threat of monotheism and of polytheism in their potential for descent into fascism. He says there's a sort of fascism about rationalism and intellectualism, a sort of rigid one-party dictatorship of the mind, which forcibly suppresses feelings and intuitions, expressed in concrete images and symbolized in the telling of stories. So rationalistic, intellectualistic ways of thinking that everything is bound by logic. The more you devote yourself to this kind of rationalistic mode of thought, the more you become fascistic in your way of thinking. There's the right way to think, and there's the wrong way to think. There's the logical way to think, and then there's everything else which has no real value because it's not logical. So this is just like any of the other things I was talking about, truth or whatever, freedom or whatever becomes the primary thing. You know, the more you take one value, one God, one thing, one way of being, one way of thinking, one way of explaining the world, and make that not just primary, but the singular, legitimate mode of thought. I mean, I hate to use the word fascism because fascism is thrown around so much that it almost doesn't mean anything. You should sort of keep it within its definition and not just throw it around. Whether this is fascism, tyranny, whatever you want to call it, the single-minded dedication to logic has a sort of totalitarian aspect to it. There's this is the way to think about things, and everything else is illegitimate. And is that a danger? I mean, is that dangerous? I would say it's not my inclination to say that anything that you could conceivably tag the word fascism onto it then it by default becomes automatically dangerous. There's a presumption there that fascism equals danger, and I'm not sure that really holds up. But there certainly can be a repression of all the other ways of thinking that can happen when you do that, when you prioritize that to that extent. But he says that there's a sort of danger in polytheism too, in the sense that the greater the fragmentation, the greater the peril of some monistic organization of study or devotion. So in polytheism, if you allow the polytheism to fragment your society, he says the greater the fragmentation, the more vulnerable it is to some sort of takeover by some singular fascistic way of thinking that can bring order to chaos. If you allow society to prioritize chaos and disorder and disarray and fragmentation and dissolution and dissolving all of our social bonds, if you elevate that dissolution as a singular goal, society fragments. There's no common understanding, and anyone or any state, any theory, any ideology that says, you know what, I can unify this with force. I can force this fragmented society to become one again. That has a great power of taking over and dominating and making itself the one single way. But this is because the fragmentation is ripe. Because the fragmentation can't hold. It's always vulnerable to takeover. It's always vulnerable because people don't want to live in a fragmented society. So polytheism has its own danger, right? Polytheism has its own danger of fragmentation, and monotheism has its danger of fascism. One is chaos taken to the extreme. One is order taken to the extreme. And you don't want extreme chaos, and you don't want extreme order. You want balance. You want to be able to find order in those parts of life where order is called for, and chaos in those parts of life where chaos is called for. I think we have a natural revulsion at the idea that of either of these things being too powerful, too much. I want to have the freedom to be able to think outside the box a little bit, to put forward ideas that are outside the mainstream. I want to be able to dissent. I want to be able to voice my opinion without fear of repercussion, at least within some constraints, right? I mean, some constraints are good, but too much constraint is bad, and too much fragmentation is bad. Too much dissolution is bad. Too much of just about anything is bad. So polytheism and monotheism both run the risk of going too far, but that shouldn't surprise anyone because just about everything runs the risk of going too far. Anyway, let's move forward. He talks about some Greek tragedy here, the Oresteia, a famous Greek trilogy. He says, quote, in Aeschylus's famous trilogy, the Oresteia, Agamemnon and his son Orestes forget the power of the Furies, or fates, in everyday life. But on the other hand, Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus forget the power of Apollo. The curse of this family, called Atreus, is that as long as a man or woman neglects the Furies on the one hand, or Apollo on the other, life is tragic. In the third play of the trilogy, the Eumenides, the curse is ended, but it ends in heaven on Mount Olympus by the power of yet a third sort of divinity, Athena. Athena knows it would be unrealistic in an Apollonian age, an age of increasing complexity in war and political life, an age of rapid urbanization and technology, an age of specialized knowledge and expertise, and an age of heightened philosophical self-consciousness and agonizing reflectivity. It would be unrealistic in such an age not to acknowledge the power of Apollo, for the age is what Apollo is. Yet she makes place for the Furies, the guardians of close family ties among blood relatives, the chthonic deities of the ecological balance in nature, the upholders of femininity in a time when women are masculated and men are emasculated. Athena acknowledges in the Furies the deep rootedness of the origin and fate of an Apollonian people. In another of Aeschylus's plays, Prometheus Bound, the title character announces that Zeus will one day die because he forgets other gods and asserts himself as king over them all. He has come into power by rendering his father impotent, just as his father, Cronus, in a former time had come into power by asserting himself over Zeus's grandfather, Ouranos, whose name means heaven itself. But Zeus, by thinking himself free of these other powers, only succeeds in deceiving himself and bringing about the day of his own demise. Prometheus's secret concerning the death of God is that Zeus will one day die of a disease we call monotheism. By repressing or forgetting the gods, which one can only do in the name of yet another, one only succeeds in bringing about the eventual loss of power, of that in which one has invested all significance. We all have Orestian complexes. This means that as long as we persist in asserting one power over others, we will lose the richness and depth of having multiple resources. But we will also thereby eventually lose even the one power in a traumatic death of God. The clue from Athena is to make a place for them all when they wish to appear as resources of meaning. The result, of course, will be polytheism, but the function of such a polytheism is to put an end to the curse of the house of Atreus, to put an end to the vicious Promethean and willful cycle of gods, a sort of pendulum action in the pit of our being. End quote. Okay, so this is a bit about the Aristeid trilogy, and what you have here is the house of Atreus, and this is Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, and the conflict between Agamemnon and his son Orestes, and Clytemnestra, and Agamemnon kills his daughter before the Trojan War in order to placate the gods and get the correct good fortune for their trip to Troy. And his wife Clytemnestra is filled with rage over this, and she finds herself a lover. And when Agamemnon returns from Troy, Clytemnestra and her lover kill Agamemnon. But then Agamemnon's son Orestes wants to avenge his father, so he kills his mother Clytemnestra. And each of these have a sort of there's a conflict between the gods here. So because Clytemnestra has killed Agamemnon, Apollo, a male god, Apollo is with Orestes in enacting vengeance for his slain father. But because Orestes kills his mother, now the Furies want to punish Orestes. So one of the Furies are with Clytemnestra and Apollo is with Agamemnon, and each side of the family has forgotten the god of the other side. So they've each elevated one value, and they have neglected the other value. And here you see, like I've spoken about previously, like you can go back to the episode on Sexual Personae by Camille Paglia, and how we see the Apollonian mindset is at least related to order, masculinity, and even taken to the extreme, fascism. And then Dionysus, which is a chthonic god, an earthy god, a god of dissolution, and the Furies in this tragedy kind of represent that, not Dionysus, but the Furies, but you still have this conflict, are the sort of earthy, feminine, chthonic deities of blood and kin, and vengeance for Orestes killing his mother, which goes against the natural order, and so the Furies are pursuing Orestes. So you've got two different, in one sense, sort of right wing. Apollo can be seen as sort of right wing. Right, the Apollonian mindset in the present day, the modern sort of right-wing paganism tends to be very Apollonian, and the modern left-wing paganism tends to be very Dionysian or very chthonic, very into the Earth Mother, right, Mother Earth. These two types of modern paganism are also two types of politics, two types of seeing the world, masculine and feminine, the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, right? I mean, Apollo's a sun god. He's an Olympian. There's a conflict here between the Olympian and the chthonic, the earth and the sky. And because each side of the family has neglected the other side and has taken one and set it as priority, and then Athena comes in and says, we have to make room for the Furies. We have to make room for Apollo. We have to make room for the various gods. All the gods must be worshipped. None of the gods can be excluded. Ultimately, Athena sides with Apollo, but says we will allow for space for the feminine in our world, in our religion. So there's a balance here, and neither of them are elevated. Both of them have space in the world and in the religion. And this balance, this bringing together and recognizing the domains of both of the gods and both of the ways of being is polytheism. And, Athena, I'm very fond of Athena as a goddess because she's not even the goddess of one thing. She's the goddess of multiple things. She's the goddess of war and of wisdom and of crafts. And she's the goddess of mortals. She's the goddess of the city of Athens. And mortals have multiple aspects to them. Mortals aren't just, properly balanced, functioning mortal isn't just bound up in one singular idea, but has to contend with the various parts of life, has to contend with the home life, has to contend with work, has to contend with politics, has to contend with crafts. A city has to do a bunch of things. It can't just do one thing. It has to make all things. It has to be prepared for war. It has to have wise rulers. Mortals are bound up in a whole plethora of different aspects. And Athena, as sort of the goddess of civilization, has to make room for the different deities, has to make room for the different types of ways of being. And so Athena is almost the goddess of polytheism in that way. And the idea here is to end the curse of the house of Atreus, to put an end to this sort of cycle of rejection. And the interesting other aside he makes here is about Zeus and Prometheus and the prophecy of Prometheus that Zeus would die because he asserts himself as king. But in another way of saying it is that the death of God, Prometheus' secret concerning the death of God is that Zeus will one day die of a disease we call monotheism. So Zeus killed his father, or I don't know if he killed his father. I guess he, Kronos isn't dead, but he rejected his father and was able to conquer his father and become the king of gods, just as his father was able to conquer his father and become the king. There's a sort of usurpation. The father is defeated by the son takes over as the new king of gods. So of course, we can expect that the cycle will continue and that Zeus will in turn be conquered by his son. Now, this author says Zeus will be conquered by monotheism because he thinks that he is out of the cycle and he is the one king who will rule forever, and he'll no longer respect the other gods and become a tyrant, and that will be his downfall. Maybe that's what will happen. Maybe that's what happened. But I think that it's clear if we understand mythology as being bound up with reality and with human history, we can see that paganism was conquered by Christianity in Europe. The Greek paganism, the Greco-Roman paganism, was conquered by Christianity. So in a way, Christ conquered Zeus in the same way that Zeus conquered Kronos and Kronos conquered Ouranos. And then Christ in turn will be conquered in the same manner. It's an ongoing son conquering and replacing the father. This would presume that in some form, Christ is the son of Zeus. Now, Christ we talk about as the son of God, so that's not too far off if we say that Zeus is like God, then Christ is the son of God. But in Christianity, obviously, you can't draw a clear parallel here because in Christianity, Christ is the son of God, but he is also God manifest, and he's not in opposition. There's no opposition between the Holy Father and the Holy Son, Christ and Yahweh. There's no struggle between these two. They're in accord with one another. But mythologically, in a polytheistic mythology, you might say that, in a way, I have my own kind of version of this that I think makes sense mythologically. If you were to imagine some mythological figure standing in for Christianity, and that would be a mythological figure that could be understood as the son of Zeus, and it would represent Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, would represent all of those things. This mythological figure that stands in for those. I think Mithras makes the perfect candidate because he came about around the same time as Christianity and killed the bull. Mithras kills the bull. Zeus is represented by the bull. That's his kind of one of his animals. So Mithras killing the bull is like Christianity killing ancient paganism, sort of a symbol of that phenomena. Then Mithras in turn himself killed by his son, or I don't know. It's the myths are still kind of cloudy and haven't quite been defined yet. But something, if we think about mythology as being related to the actual events of the world, and this is like the sort of Shakespearean, the world of fairy, something is astray in the world of fairy, and then things go astray in the world of the material world. There's as above, so below. There's a bond between the material world and the mythological world, and affects things in one world, affect things in the other world. That one is an analogy of the other. You would then, I think, you would see that the mythology, the story goes on, right? It doesn't just end where, oh, Zeus is the king of gods. Zeus was always king of gods. Zeus will always be king of gods. It's not eternal in that way. It changes over time. It goes Oranos to Kronos to Zeus to Mithras to ? The new god who hasn't arrived yet. So let's move forward where he talks about the return of polytheism. He says, quote, "One way to get the feeling back into thinking is to re-mythologize it, re-people it with gods and goddesses, so that the abstractions take on aesthetic concretion, and the ideas may be reinvested with passion. I have pointed out already that the gods and goddesses are forgotten when thinkers substitute abstract concepts for their names, and when the stories become transformed rationalistically into types of formal logic. Images become ideas, narrative becomes syllogism. To reverse this direction is not to give up logical thinking or rational discourse. Rather, it is to become aware of the pantheon parading through our thoughts, without our control and even against our will. It is to put ourselves in touch once again with the deeper dimensions of ideas and thought, to acknowledge the religious polytheism that we do not possess, but that indeed possesses us. In the beginning of Western thinking about meaning and being, men were still dimly aware of the incipient religious polytheism of their everyday ideas and logic. Aristotle acknowledged that his philosophical concept of the unmoved mover, which is the essence of being itself, was nothing more than an abstract name for what in popular religion had been called the gods. He admitted, too, that the whole of school philosophy was just another vocabulary, formal and logical, for what Hesiod had told in mythopoetic forms as the stories of the gods. If we have managed to get rid of the gods by thinking in a particular sort of way, that is, monotheistically, and if the concepts, categories, ideas, and logics of that thinking are simply new names for the gods, then there is a curious twist, a sort of ironic reversal in the story. We did not get rid of the gods and goddesses at all. They are still there, as Aristotle knew. Repressed and forgotten, to be sure, but actually alive and well, lurking in our ideas, shadowing our logics, insinuating their stories into our categories and concepts. We have just pretended that we did not notice these sleeping beauties, and in the process we forgot the stories, which is to say that we forgot that we were pretending. In order once again to remember what we have forgotten, and in order to stop our rationalistic pretense, we shall have to retrace the process of how we came to forget and pretend. In this way, we shall be able slowly to relearn to be articulate in our new cultural polytheism. What the early Greek thinkers really objected to in polytheism was the anthropomorphic way of thinking about human meaning, giving ideas names as if the gods were people. This amounted to personifying the matters of deepest concern to man and telling stories about the matters that had been thus peopled. This was Xenophanes' main gripe. But in calling for a principle of unity, whether one god, Xenophanes, or being itself, Parmenides, the early Greek philosophers did not escape polytheistic thinking. They just gave it less compelling names and guaranteed that only an esoteric few would thereafter be considered sophisticated and educated enough to be called thinkers, i.e. philosophers. If we were to look closely enough into the ideas, concepts, and categories of sophisticated philosophers of the 5th and 4th centuries in Greece, we should be able to uncover all the gods and goddesses of the polytheistic pantheon. And if we were to persist in our probing, we might be able to delve into these philosophers' logics, the formal structures of their thought, and there discover the narratives, the imagined processes of meaning in a lively and human form. All Western thinking may be seen as springing from two impulses and two strategies. The classicist Francis Cornford called these impulses and their corresponding strategies scientific and mystical. In the beginning, Anaximander is an example of the former and Pythagoras of the latter. Scientific thinking takes the evolution of Western consciousness from early cosmogonists in Ionia, who thought and spoke about the nature of the universe, through a long history of metaphysics to the birth of natural science in the Renaissance and finally ends in various positivisms of a contemporary science and technology. Mystical thinking follows a different but parallel route. It begins with the mystical mathematics of Pythagoras, moves counterculturally through metaphysical theologies and not a few heresies, Gnosticisms of several sorts, comes to manifest itself in pietism after the Reformation, and ends in various forms of Romanticism, from some 19th century literatures in England and Germany to men and women fascinated by sensitivity training, Don Juan, the Yaqui sorcerer, and the I Ching. End quote. So a couple things there. His main point is, to start off, he says, one way to get the feeling back into thinking, one way to take thinking and open it up to feeling as well, is to re-mythologize the world, to re-people it with gods and goddesses. He says the gods and goddesses aren't really gone. They've just been transformed. They've been renamed. And they've been renamed as abstract concepts. He says to reverse this is not to give up logical thinking, but it's to become aware of the pantheon parading through our thoughts. So to recognize the different aspects of our own consciousness and to allow them to have a sort of religious significance, to re-allow them to have mythologies, to re-allow them to have stories. And he even talks about Aristotle and the unmoved mover. What's interesting, most people don't really recognize this, is that Aristotle didn't talk about one unmoved mover that moves and guides everything. When you really dig into what Aristotle had to say about the so-called unmoved mover, he proposed that there were multiple unmoved movers, and that they sort of in that way, then because we hear a lot about how Aristotle believed in God because he believed in the unmoved mover. He believed in the monotheistic Abrahamic God in his own way. He logically came to the recognition of the existence of God in the unmoved mover. But when you see that he proposed several unmoved movers, suddenly you think, well, okay, he really didn't work his way to monotheism. He was just re-describing polytheism in new terms, a new terminology for the existing polytheism. And he says that a lot of the philosophical categories and concepts are really just, especially in the old days, are really just renamed gods and goddesses. And he does mention Cornford in here. He mentions Francis Cornford. And you'll remember I reviewed a book by Cornford, and that was called From Religion to Philosophy. And that talked about a lot of this stuff here, and I would highly recommend you go back and have a listen to that episode, because he talks about how the polytheistic religious beliefs were renamed and reconceived in a less supernatural way, in a more naturalistic way. They were reconceived as concepts, perhaps even as Platonic ideals. Certainly one thing that Plato talked about in the Republic was justice. What is justice? And beauty. And he talks about the Platonic ideal of justice and the Platonic ideal of beauty. But also, we should recognize that justice and beauty are gods and goddesses in the Greek polytheistic pantheon. And so it's a sort of otherworldly thing, entity, if you were to look at it polytheistically, ideal, if you were to look at it in a more Platonic manner. What exactly that ideal is, it's a thing, hard to put your finger on, hard to see. You can only kind of see its echoes and its ramifications in the world, but it's not of the world. Like Platonic beauty is not a thing in the world. It's a thing in the realm of ideas that manifests itself. It's reflected in the world. It's reflected in matter. That's a sort of transcendental concept of a singular entity. Once you take the Platonic ideal of justice and beauty and you attribute to it some sort of agency, now you really have gods and goddesses. So all really Plato did was take the agency away and say, okay, if justice doesn't really do things, doesn't act in the world in a conscious way, because justice isn't conscious, he just kind of naturalizes Greek mythology. Anyway, let's keep moving here. we get to Moira and Dike, and you'll remember again in the Cornford episode, I talked about Moira and Ananke. I think that Ananke is a better concept for the modern world than Moira, because it's less bound up in morality and more. I mean, Ananke is necessity, Moira is fate, but it has a moral aspect to it that Ananke doesn't have. Anyway, in this section, he says, quote, "Ancient Greek religious images, gods, soul, fate, law, are the fundamentals of all later thinking, scientific and mystical, even to this very day. These old images have become our notions of substance, cause and effect, matter, and so on. The outward differences between both types of Western thinking on the one hand and polytheistic religion on the other only disguise an inward and substantial affinity between these two successive products of the same consciousness. Yet when we think about anything, we find today that we have lost the sense for the affinity between the gods and goddesses and our science or our mysticism. Thus our new polytheism is without a language, a mode of articulation by which it can understand itself. Our science has banished the vague, but in the process, its rationalistic mode has swept away the feeling in the thinking that makes life lively. The gods have disappeared. The soul is reduced to a dust of material particles. In a word, life has gone out of nature. Admirable as a tool of research, abstract thought strikes a chill of horror into men who will not seek the living among the dead. Our modern thinking is dead because it lacks the excitement and compellingness that a story can stir in man. Even our various romanticisms are often abstract, strange, and foreign. They lack the earthiness of the old gods and goddesses. But it was not always that way with Western thinking. The philosophic muse is not a motherless Athena. If the individual intellect is her father, her older and more august parent is polytheistic religion. Some examples will make the point clearer. One can generalize and say that behind Anaximander and the scientific mode of thinking is the whole Olympian pantheon of gods and goddesses that Homer conveys to us in epic proportion. On the other hand, behind Pythagoras and the mystical mode of thinking lurk the shades of Orpheus, Dionysus, and the whole chthonic horde. The impact of this generalization is felt more deeply, however, when it is specified in the case of particular concepts and ideas that predominate in all our thought. Behind scientific thinking lies the notion of Moira, or fate. All the Olympian gods and goddesses comported themselves, as expressed in their stories, according to that most ancient of all religious notions, Moira. It was she by whom gods and men alike were bound, but only by a very small step of the rationalizing and abstracting imagination. The stories of Moira and every Olympian are transformed into the principle of a universal scientific law, to which all nature, including human and social nature, is bound. It is this natural order that the scientific philosopher is after, and for natural science following the Renaissance, this order is the indubitable axiom of thinking. Similarly, just as Moira lies behind scientific thinking, so the notion of Dike, righteousness and justice, lies at the root of mystical thinking. The Dike of righteousness and justice is expressed in the stories of the cycle of nature, especially in the myths of Dionysus and the chthonic gods generally, Demeter and Persephone, Orpheus, the Titans, and so on. What is especially apparent in the Dike stories is a principle that mystical thinkers will come to think of as time. Just as Moira and her special representative Zeus will come to be called being by the philosophers, so Dike, whose expression may abstractly be thought of as temporality, will come to be called becoming. Cornford shows the significance of this subtle change in vocabulary in a book called The Unwritten Philosophy, where he points out how, in early Greek philosophy, the abstract notion of becoming was still merged in the concrete image of birth. So where the polytheist speaks of the birth of the gods in stories like Hesiod's, stories that constitute a cycle of one series of gods after another, the thinker, already tending toward the monotheism of thought mentioned in the last chapter, speaks of the process of becoming, the center of pluralistic values, the process of concretion, and so on. We can see in the thoughtful interest in cause and effect on the part of Greek philosophers and contemporary scientists the old religious practice of speaking and thinking about the gods and goddesses. Especially is this the case in the genealogical stories which trace in a narrative, mythic manner the coherent plan, Moira and Dike, of all the powers of life. The point that I am making is that at first there was little difference between theologia and systematic philosophy. Both work with doctrines, but the former does it in a mythical way. I have already cited Aristotle to the effect that philosophers and theologians are doing the same thing, but it is precisely Aristotle, Plato, and other professional thinkers like them who are the source of repressing a concrete, imagistic mode of thinking. Aristotle does this by saying that the philosophers proceed by strict methods of proof, and those who tell the tales of the gods do not. What Aristotle has already forgotten is that those strict methods of proof are also the processes whose proper names are gods and goddesses and their stories. Aristotle is not the only one who makes a concession as to philosophy being, in fact, a thinking about thinking that is rooted in stories of the gods and goddesses. Cicero, in his De Natura Deorum, and St. Augustine, in the De Civitate Dei, see the physicists from Thales to Anaxagoras as only repeating what they found in their Greek sources. In fact, not only does all Western thinking have its root in Greek religion, but every system of Greek philosophy, save only the skeptic, culminated in theology, and we can distinguish a Platonic, Aristotelian, Epicurean, Stoic, Neo-Pythagorean, and Neoplatonic theology. What we see in this story about the early Greek thinkers is that philosophy was originally a way of thinking and speaking about meaning and being that was dependent upon Greek polytheism, for its ideas, concepts, and categories, which were once the images of gods and goddesses, and for its formal structure of thought or logic, which were once narrative processes and mythic tales. This, of course, implies that polytheism lurks in a thinking that thinks itself monotheistic, that is, thinks itself governed by a single principle of being and by a univocal logic that will lead to truth in the singular. End quote. Okay, so bit of a slightly longer section. He talks more about the ideas of Cornford here. He talks about Moira, or fate, and like I've said before, like I said in the Cornford episode on the From Religion to Philosophy, Moira has a bit of a moral aspect to it. I think at least my understanding from reading that book and also just thinking about the way these things are described in general is that Ananke really means necessity, and its demands are strict. There's no escaping Ananke. There's nothing outside necessity. It wouldn't be necessary if it was able to be circumvented. Ananke cannot be circumvented, whereas Moira, because it has a moral aspect to it, it can be circumvented in some extreme cases, and this is when gods or people go outside the bounds of the natural order. So Moira is like adherence to the natural order, but in such a way that if one wanted to, and perhaps if one was capable enough, one could stand outside the natural order. One could go beyond the natural order, or one could go against the natural order. So I think Moira is something that has a duty to adhere to the natural order in the way of the world, whereas Ananke is much more deterministic and strict. There is no going outside Ananke. And so to me, when I think of a comparison, I don't think of Moira and Dike as much as I think of Ananke and Dike, because Dike is justice, and Dike has much more to do with morality, the right way, doing things the right way or the wrong way. And Dike kind of initiates the presence of morality. So you might say, although Ananke is typically presented as a goddess, and Dike is also presented as a goddess, in my mind, I see Moira as a sort of offspring of Ananke and Dike. Dike introduces choice and free will in making moral decisions, in trying to be a just person, trying to do the just thing or engage in justice. has some degree of willpower involved. You choose to be just. And if it's totally demanded of you, if it's by necessity, if it's by the dictate of Ananke, can it really be considered just or unjust? Some amount of what we would consider free will is necessary for that to have a moral implication. So Moira being a natural order that is demanded but is not commanded in such a way that we have no way around it, Moira seems to be a bit of a synthesis between Dike and Ananke. That's my conception of how these concepts fit together. But Cornford, as I said in the episode From Religion to Philosophy, Cornford talks a lot about Moira, and this author picks up from there and talks about Moira. But just my own impression is that for what he's describing, Ananke is probably the better figure. But of course, Ananke is less well known than Moira also. But there are some other things he says here that I think I disagree with, and one of them is how so you've got Moira and Dike, and Moira lies behind science, and Dike lies behind mystical thinking. So justice, morality, lies behind mystical thinking as opposed to scientific thinking, lies behind romanticism, but he ties Dike to the principle of time. For me, and I think for much of modern science, the concept of necessity is bound up with the concept of cause and effect, and necessity means things must transpire in a certain manner. So in a sense, it's bound up with time. Ananke is bound up with cause and effect, which is bound up with sequential events. However, you could also say that Ananke is unchanging, because that what was, from a deterministic standpoint, what was preordained from the beginning to be necessary will continue to be the same preordained sequence at the beginning of the sequence and at the end of the sequence. If you have a cause and effect series that can be predicted in advance, then time is a sort of meaningless component of that. Well, not meaningless, but it's a component of that. It's not, Ananke doesn't change over time. What is necessary doesn't change over time on account of its necessity. So like Parmenides, I think Parmenides was speaking about Ananke in his own way as outside of time because it was all already preordained, everything that would happen from start to finish. So Ananke stands outside of time, and maybe justice stands inside of time, because what will be just isn't known in advance. Whether someone will act in a just manner or an unjust manner, from our limited perspective, we make these sorts of judgment calls. And from our limited perspective within the continuum of time, not knowing how things will turn out, morality becomes a question. But, personally, I think I'm not sure that I would say that, as he does, that Dike is, equivalent with time. He says, just as Moira and her special representative Zeus will come to be called being, so Dike, whose expression may abstractly be thought of as temporality, will come to be called becoming. So being and becoming, and we've heard of these terms before. Being is unchanging. Being is sort of outside of time as well, and becoming is changing. Becoming goes from one thing to another. It becomes something. Being doesn't become things. Being is, and the things in the world become. The things in the world are bound by time. The objects, the beings, are bound by time, but being itself stands outside of time. So, but do we really want to pin Moira / Ananke with being and justice with time? I'm not so sure, because, like I said, cause and effect, and time is pretty important to the way things are destined to unfold. I mean, it's hard to say a goddess whose name basically means fate should be unrelated to time. I think fate and time are actually pretty bound up together. So that seems an odd, coordination between Moira and being, and then justice or Dike and time. I don't know how absolute that connection is, but apparently over time, the one was associated with the one and the other with the other. He talks about another book by Cornford, The Unwritten Philosophy. I would definitely like to have a look at that one. I was really impressed with Cornford's last book, so I would like to get into some other Cornford to really dig out what he's talking about here. But anyway, let's move forward to the last section that I want to read here today, talking a little bit about Heidegger, a fairly short section, but he talks a little bit about Heidegger here, where he says, quote, Heidegger proposes that we think of the Greek gods as worlds, real worlds. They name and their stories describe realities of life, which will later become the logos, the logic of the philosophers, but are fundamentally mythos, the stories of the gods. The logic by which all Western men think, therefore, presupposes the logos and mythos, name and story of a god. In the course of time, the names and the stories have been forgotten, and then we even forget that we have forgotten, and deny that it is gods and goddesses about whom we speak, or better, who speak through our every thought and word. In this way, logic of a rational sort has become an unrestrained dictator in our lives. As one interpreter of Heidegger put it, with the precise methods of deduction and abstraction, man builds up the general concepts which enable him to keep under his hand the rich, concrete life that tends to spread apart chaotically after the bindings of logos have been concealed. But now we have lost that logos, and the god of that logos has died. Heidegger attempts to go on by searching new stories, new songs, new dramas, but not new professional philosophies. In his later years, he has turned to modern poets who are telling our story, and especially to the poets whose singing, i.e. the drama of whose verse, is knowingly and feelingly linked to the gods and goddesses who have been there all along, though forgotten in the name of one god. As Heidegger has said, it is the time of the no more of the gods that have fled, and the not yet of the God that is coming. Perhaps now we would want to encourage Heidegger to revise his saying, to read, it is the time of the no more of the God who has fled, and the not yet of the gods who are coming. One would urge this revision, even though we have already seen that Nietzsche's prophecy is at hand. Polytheism will not fully be in our thinking and speaking until the gods and goddesses have been named forthrightly. End quote. So we see there in his discussion of Heidegger, it does seem to recall some of the stuff we saw in the last episode from Heidegger's essay on Hölderlin. He does talk about how Heidegger, now this is written in the first version, 74. I believe that was before the death of Heidegger, so he speaks as if Heidegger is still alive. But in Heidegger's later years, he was turning away from philosophy and beginning to study poetry, and I think he's referring to Heidegger's studies of Hölderlin in particular, because he talks about that line I talked about in the last book, about standing between the era of the gods who have gone and the God who has not yet arrived. And the author Miller here makes the same recommendation that I made, that where we really stand more accurately is between the God, at this point in time, the God who has died, the death of God, the God who is behind us. We're after God, but we're not yet to the world of the gods who will arrive. And so, like I said in the last episode, how according to Hölderlin, like the poet is like an eagle flying ahead of the storm of the oncoming gods, heralding their forthcoming arrival. So I thought that was interesting how he kind of ties back to that same essay that I was speaking of last episode. But at any rate, and he does also talk about how the gods and goddesses must be forthrightly named. And I think that's also a reference to the naming of the gods that we spoke of in the last episode as well. So who's going to name these gods? Well, it's the poets, I suppose. What is a poet? Who is a poet? I'm not a poet. I don't write poetry. But I certainly think about these issues, and I think about the concept of these oncoming gods, and I think about the changes that I think will be necessary to the stories, to the mythology. I personally, I think about the inadequacy of the modern polytheists who would proclaim that Zeus is the king of the gods. I think that is a sort of delusion that pretends that the last 2,000 years didn't happen. If you're going to proclaim Zeus to be the king of the gods, you might as well proclaim Ouranos to be the king of the gods. We all know Ouranos has been superseded, Kronos has been superseded, and as it's obvious as the light of day that Zeus has also been superseded, and his replacement has now in turn is becoming superseded. Christians will disagree, but that's what I see. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.